Alright, in this video I'll show you guys how to comp homes. In the last video I believe I showed you guys how to do it for land. In this case I'll show you guys how to do it for homes. So the first thing again you want to do when you comping homes is you want to figure out where it's at, right? In this case, the home is just right around in the Highland Hills. So kind of make sure you're accurate when you're pulling comps for some of these properties. So the home is right around in here, right? So now we get an understanding of where it's at. And another major thing, right, is when you're comping homes, is you never want to cross these major highways, nor do you want to cross over train tracks, right? Just because it's considered, in a different subdivision, and then it makes comping a little bit harder. If you have to, right, and there isn't a single comp near your subject property, make sure you buffer that towards your ARV and you're extremely conservative, because you more than likely you want to stay as close as possible as you can to the subject property. So the next thing you want to do is you want to figure out subject property, square foot, beds, bath, and the year it's built, right? So in this case, it's built in 1964. So we're gonna scroll down, right, and we'll put 1950, right? And then in this case, we'll put 1970, right? So you want to stay. You don't want, it doesn't exactly have to be the same year, as when the home was built, but you want to stay relatively as close as you can to that year. And also you want to look at sold comps, not necessarily ones that are listed for sale. In addition to that, you also want to make sure you're pulling comps that have sold in the last 6 months, right? Both for home and both for land. You want to make sure you're pulling comps that have sold within the last 6 months. If you have to go over that, and there isn't a single piece of comp in the last 6 months and you go 12 months, again, make sure you're buffering that towards ARV and you're being conservative. Another thing I like to do, right, typically in this case, there isn't that many results. But if there is 50, 60 homes, another thing you want to do is you want to make sure you're close as possible to that square footage of the subject property. That way you can narrow down all the other big homes that you don't necessarily need. From there, what I like to do is I typically, since I already have an idea of where the home is, I'll draw another border just so we're only looking at homes that are close to the subject property. From there, we'll just look at all these newly sold homes, kind of looking at their condition. In this case, this looks like a full renovated home, right, from head to toe. You're looking at the flooring, you're looking at the walls. Looks like the investor that did this clearly spent a lot of money and time renovating this home. Another good thing is it also sold within 6 months. It sold at 244, right? And then we'll keep a mental note of that, and we'll save it, right? We'll save it, and then we'll go on to look for another property. Typically, again, both with homes and land, you want to get about 2 to 3 of recently sold comps, right? Excuse me. You want to get 2 to 3 recently sold comps, just so you can be as accurate as possible towards ARV. In this case, this also looks like it's been, remodeled, not necessarily as best as this one, but to a certain extent they did remodel it. You can see they painted the exterior and took real good care of it. Another thing too, guys, if you want to see if the home has been remodeled or not, 9 times out of 10 the listing agent will have verbiages like updated, upgraded, fully renovated, things like that within the description, and that kind of shows you whether the home has been remodeled or not. In this case, this one ended up selling for around 240. So that's great. So you'll save it as well, and then you want to look for one more, just so you could be as accurate as possible. So we're looking. This one is a 4-bedroom. I believe our subject property is 3 bedrooms. You want to stay again close as possible to the subject property. This case doesn't seem like it's been renovated. this as well. Seems like they've renovated, taking good care of it, but let's see if we could find a little bit better one. That's kind of got a full renovation done to it. This one doesn't seem like they've done either. And this one doesn't seem like it as well. So right, this is kind of the best out of all those three. And they did renovate it to a certain extent. Looks like they painted the exterior, and kind of took care of the home. And we can see that it sold for $230, right? So the next step, what you want to do is, when finding ARVs, you want to get whatever price is sold for and divide it by square foot, right? So in this case, you want to get 230,000, and you want to divide it by 1137, or excuse me, you want to divide it by 1,137, and then there you'll get the average square foot, and you want to do the same thing to this here as well, right? You want to get what it's sold for. In this case, we'll say 239 just to be conservative, and then you'll divide it by this number here, square foot. And same thing as well for this. You want to get what the home sold for, which is, we'll say 244, and you want to divide it by this number here. And once you get all three of those numbers, right, let's say that numbers end up coming out to being, whatever the case, they end up coming out to being about 21, 54, and 64, right? Those are the price per square foot for three of these homes, right? Obviously, I didn't run the numbers, but whenever you guys do run numbers, you'll come up with three different numbers, right? And typically they're numbers, and then with decimals, and then you have a few other numbers above it. Typically, you want to pick, let's say the number comes out to about 12 point, whatever, right? You want to typically get two numbers after the decimal. If you get one, it's not going to make a big deal. If you don't get none, it's not going to make a big deal. Typically, I just like going for two numbers after the decimal, just because it makes it a little bit more accurate, and it kind of gives you a better idea of what ARV is at. So let's say, you get three different numbers, right? You get 12.56. Another one you get is 15.98. Another one you get is 13.67, right? So once you get all three of these numbers, you'll add them up, and they equal about 42.1. Next step you want to do is you want to divide them by 3, right? And then you get the average price per square foot for all three of those numbers, and it comes out to being about 14.03. After that, you would want to times it by the subject property square foot, which comes out to being about 1422. And in that case, it gives you an ARV of, this ends up being a little low. So let me just, let's say the average square foot, divided comes out to about 76, right? Whatever. The ARV comes out to be about 65,000, right? Obviously, it's a home, so it's going to be 10 times more bigger. Typically, price per square foot for homes you want to see within the ranges of, well, actually, there isn't necessarily a range. It's just based on what market you're in, but typically they'd be in the hundreds, low 80s, 90s, whatever the case may be. In this case, this is just an example, but if realistically speaking, if we're saying average square foot is point, whatever, we'll times it by, so with the property square foot, and then we'll end up getting, the home being worth 227,000. In this case, I typically like to go a little bit lower to be a little bit more conservative, so I want to say maybe 225,000, right? And then thereafter, you'll figure out rehab, and let's say the rehab ends up coming out to being about, 50,000, right? So this is how you run numbers to figure out your MAO based on a 50,000 rehab. So your ARV comes out to be about 225,000. You want to times that by 0.7, right? And once you get that number, you want to divide or subtract that by 50,000 as rehab, right? And then you want to subtract that in addition to that. Let's say you want to make 10K, right, as an assignment fee, whatever the case may be. Your MAO comes out to being about 97,500, right? And then in this case, like I said, you always want to be conservative. If it says 97,500, we'll call it 97,000 even, right? And then, typically I like to anchor about maybe 5, 7, 8 grand above under that, just so obviously sellers are not typically going to take your first offer unless they're already low enough. That way, if you have to come up, you're not necessarily going over your MAO, and you're kind of right. You're staying right in between where you want to be at. Um, but yeah, that is how you run numbers on homes. Like I said, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The main thing again is staying as close as possible as you can to the subject property. Make sure beds, bath, square foot, and year built all close to what the subject property is. And then in addition to that, you want to make sure you're not pulling comps from 12 months or to a year. You're pulling comps as recent as possible. But yeah, if you have any questions on how to run, comps on homes or lands, let me know, and then I'll make a video on that as well.